When a woman distances herself and starts ignoring you, most men don't actually respond to what's happening. They respond to what it feels like. And what it feels like is rejection. So the behavior changes immediately. More messages, more checking, more attempts to fix the gap she created. But here's the part that gets overlooked. Distance is rarely random. It's not always a sign she's gone. And it's not always a clean decision to end things. In many cases, it's a shift in emotional state that she hasn't fully explained, even to herself. And when you react too quickly, you don't fix the situation, you define it. Because now she's not just creating distance, she's seeing your response to it. That response matters more than the distance itself. You've probably experienced it before. One day she's present, replying normally, engaging, even initiating small conversations. Then something changes. Not a fight, not a clear reason, just space. Messages become slower, replies become shorter. The energy drops without explanation. And you're left trying to decode silence that has no clear language. That's where most men misread everything. They assume silence is the message, so they fill it. But in reality, silence is often just a pause in emotional alignment, not a final decision. And how you behave inside that pause is what determines whether the connection stabilizes or collapses further. Because when a woman pulls back, she isn't only measuring her own feelings, she's also observing yours, not in an obvious way, not through direct testing, but through pattern recognition. Does he panic? Does he chase harder? Does he lose his emotional baseline? Or does he stay consistent even when the feedback changes? That difference is not small. It defines whether she feels pressure or space. And pressure rarely brings someone closer. But here's where this gets misunderstood. The goal is not to play it cool or pretend nothing happened. And it's not to ignore her completely either. Both extremes distort the dynamic. What actually matters is something simpler and harder to do in real time. Stability without reaction. Not emotional escalation. Not withdrawal punishment. Not overcorrection in either direction. Just a steady presence that doesn't collapse when her energy changes. Because when a woman distances herself, she is not only stepping back from you, she is also watching what you become in your own space when she does. And most men unknowingly answer that question in the worst possible way, by changing completely. What you're about to understand is the one adjustment that stops that spiral from deepening, not by chasing her back, not by ignoring her out of ego, but by doing one specific thing that resets how the dynamic is being interpreted on both sides. And once you see it clearly, the situation stops feeling random and starts looking structured. List the 7 section topics. Make it interesting. 1. The first mistake men make when she pulls away, and why it makes things worse. The first mistake happens fast, almost instantly after she starts to pull away. A message takes longer than usual. Then another one goes unanswered. Then the tone shifts, shorter replies, less warmth, less initiation. And something inside you clicks. You feel the gap. And the first instinct is not analysis, it's action. You try to close it. Another message, a follow-up, a slightly different tone to get her back into the conversation. It feels reasonable in your mind, like you're fixing something that slipped out of place. But from her side, it doesn't register as fixing. It registers as escalation. Because what she's actually doing is not just stepping back emotionally, she's observing the space she created. And in that space, your reaction becomes the information. Here's what most men miss. When a woman pulls away, she's not always making a final decision about you. She's often testing what the dynamic becomes when she stops actively holding it together. Not in a dramatic or calculated way, but in a quiet, almost automatic check. What happens if I reduce my presence here? And now your response enters that equation. If you immediately increase effort, you remove ambiguity, but you also reveal something else, dependency on momentum. She feels the shift, even if she doesn't articulate it, because now the interaction is no longer balanced. It's responsive. You're reacting to her absence instead of maintaining your own baseline. And that changes how she interprets the space. You might notice a specific pattern in real situations. She pulls back slightly. You respond faster than usual. Then she pulls back even more. Not because she's punishing you, but because the space is no longer neutral. It has weight now. What men usually get wrong is assuming consistency will fix it. So they try to be more consistent. More messages, more checking in, more presence. But consistency without emotional control is not stability. It's pressure spread over time. And pressure doesn't invite closeness in this phase. It compresses it. There's another detail most men never notice. After you increase effort, her replies don't just slow down. They become more informational, less emotional tone, less engagement signals, more functional responses. She's still responding, but she's removing emotional participation. That shift is subtle, but it's decisive, because it shows she's no longer engaging with the interaction as something shared. She's managing it. So what should you do instead? Not chase, not disappear, not overcorrect. You hold your position. You respond when it makes sense, not when anxiety pushes you to. You keep your tone steady, not amplified, because what she's actually evaluating in this moment is not how fast you respond. It's whether your behavior collapses under reduced feedback. And if it doesn't collapse, if it stays unchanged even when her energy shifts, something important happens internally. The dynamic stops feeling like something she can control by simply withdrawing. And that's when the next phase begins, not because you forced her back, but because your response didn't distort the space she created. 2. Why her sudden distance is rarely what you think it is. When she pulls back, most men assume the story is already written. Interest dropped, someone else appeared, something went wrong. So they start searching for explanations that match the discomfort. But what actually happens in real behavior is far less dramatic and more internal. Her distance is often not a conclusion. It's a shift in processing. You'll notice it in the pattern. She doesn't fully disappear. She doesn't clearly explain anything. She just becomes less available in a way that feels soft, not absolute. Replies come slower, tone becomes flatter, initiation drops without any direct statement behind it. And that's where men misread it, because they treat absence of effort as absence of interest. But in many real cases, she's not withdrawing from you completely. She's withdrawing from emotional momentum. That's a different mechanism. Something changed internally. Attention, stress, external focus, emotional overload, uncertainty. And instead of communicating it directly, she reduces output. Not to end things, but to stabilize herself. Here's what this looks like in real interaction. She used to respond within minutes. Now it takes hours. She used to add small emojis or extra tone. Now replies are plain. She used to ask questions back. Now she answers and stops. Nothing is explicitly negative, but everything becomes reduced. What men get wrong is they respond to the reduction like it's rejection. So they try to restore the old version of her behavior. More energy, more messages, more attempts to recreate what was there before. But that version of her is not accessible through pressure, because she didn't remove it consciously. She stepped out of emotional flow temporarily. And if you start chasing the previous version of interaction, you force her into awareness of something she hasn't fully decided on yet. That awareness often tightens distance further. There's also a quieter layer underneath this. When she becomes distant, she's not only adjusting her interaction with you, She's also observing what remains when she reduces her contribution. Does the interaction collapse? Does it continue naturally? Does it feel forced without her input? Those are the questions being answered in silence, not through words, through continuity. And this is where most men unknowingly fail the evaluation. They overcompensate. They start filling the gap she left. Longer messages, more emotional tone, slight shifts in personality to keep things alive. But instead of stabilizing the situation, it highlights the imbalance, because now the interaction depends on effort instead of rhythm. What you should understand here is simple. Her distance is not always a statement about you. It is often a reflection of her internal state projected onto the interaction. And if you respond correctly, that projection often corrects itself. Not immediately, not through force, but through normalization. When she sees that the connection doesn't distort just because her energy changed, something resets internally. The need to maintain distance loses its purpose, and what looked like withdrawal starts behaving more like fluctuation. 3. The silent test hidden inside her silence. Silence is never just silence, not when there was already a connection. When she pulls back and stops engaging the way she used to, most men interpret it as distance with a clear meaning. She's less interested. But what's actually happening is more subtle. She's not only stepping away, she's watching what fills the space. Because silence changes the structure of interaction. When she stops initiating, stops replying with the same energy, stops participating in the rhythm you are both maintaining, something opens up. And in that opening, your behavior becomes visible in a different way. Not through what you say, but through what you do when nothing is being reinforced. You'll notice it in small patterns. Do you increase effort immediately? Do you start sending more messages than before? Do you shift tone, trying to recreate closeness? Or do you stay steady without reacting to the gap? That's the test. Not spoken, not announced, but real. Here's the part most men miss. Silence removes feedback, and without feedback, emotional behavior becomes exposed. If you're steady, nothing changes. If you're reactive, it becomes obvious quickly. And she notices that, not consciously in a calculated way, but through pattern recognition. For example, she goes quiet for a day. You respond by sending multiple messages. The moment she reappears, she replies more neutrally than before. Not because she's punishing you, but because the dynamic shifted from shared rhythm to one-sided adjustment. She's no longer interacting with you directly. She's interacting with your response to her absence. And that's a completely different experience for her. There's another layer most men overlook. During silence, she often doesn't fully disengage. She observes indirectly. She might check your presence without engaging. She might appear briefly online without initiating. She might re-enter conversations with minimal energy just to see how the space responds. These are not coincidences. They are low-intensity checks of continuity. What remains when she stops contributing? That's what she's evaluating. And most men unknowingly fail this stage by overfilling it. They try to replace silence with effort, more messages, more explanations, more presence than before. But that changes the structure entirely, because now the interaction depends on your output instead of mutual rhythm. And anything that depends too heavily on one side starts to feel unstable. So what's the correct response? You don't punish the silence. You don't mirror it with emotional withdrawal. You don't try to force re-engagement. You maintain your baseline. Same tone, same pacing, same level of effort you had before the shift. No escalation. Because what she's actually measuring is not whether you can keep her engaged when she's active. It's whether you can remain consistent when she isn't. And consistency under silence carries a different meaning than consistency under response. It signals that your behavior is not being built in reaction to her presence. It exists independently of it. And that changes how the silence itself functions. Instead of becoming a gap she uses to evaluate emotional instability, it becomes neutral space. And when silence stops producing distortion, it loses its pressure. That's when the next shift starts to appear, quietly, without announcement. 4. The one reaction that quietly pushes her further away. There's a reaction most men don't realize they're having, because it doesn't look extreme. It looks reasonable, even responsible. She pulls back, and you respond by trying to correct it. Not aggressively, not emotionally chaotic, just steady effort to fix the connection. More messages, slightly longer replies, checking in more often than usual, trying to reestablish the rhythm you remember. On the surface, it looks like care, but in the structure of the interaction, it reads differently. It reads as pressure, not because of intensity, but because of direction. You're moving toward her faster than she's moving toward you, and that imbalance changes how she experiences the space. You'll notice the shift in her behavior if you look closely. She doesn't reject you directly. She doesn't create conflict. She simply becomes more contained. Replies shorten, energy flattens, initiation drops further than before, not because she suddenly decided something, but because your reaction removed neutrality. Here's what's actually happening underneath. When she creates distance, there is a small window where nothing is defined yet. No conclusion, no emotional label, just space. And in that space, she's watching how the dynamic stabilizes on its own. But when you start adjusting your behavior immediately, that space disappears. Now the interaction has direction again, and that direction is toward her. What men get wrong is assuming effort is always neutral or positive. But effort during uncertainty has weight. It signals urgency to resolve something that hasn't been defined yet. And urgency changes perception. For example, she replies slower than usual. You respond instantly with more energy. She pulls back further without explanation. From your perspective, you're trying to keep things alive. From her perspective, the interaction is being pulled forward faster than she intended. That mismatch creates internal resistance. Not conscious rejection, but a subtle need to regain control of pacing. And the easiest way to do that is to reduce engagement. That's where distance deepens. There's also a behavioral detail most men miss entirely. When you increase effort in response to her withdrawal, she often stops adding emotional texture to her replies. No extra words, no questions back, no continuation signals, just clean, minimal responses. That's not coldness in isolation, that's containment. She's keeping interaction functional because emotional participation now feels slightly imbalanced. And once interaction becomes functional, it loses natural flow. What you should understand here is simple. The reaction that pushes her further away is not care, it's correction. Trying to restore the previous version of the connection assumes the previous version is still available. But she didn't delete it. She stepped out of it temporarily. And when you try to rebuild it immediately, you force definition onto something she hasn't resolved internally yet. So what actually stabilizes the situation? Not escalation, not withdrawal, absence of correction. You allow the space she created to exist without trying to fill it. You maintain your baseline behavior, no emotional amplification, no compensating for her distance, no urgency to return things to normal. Because normal hasn't been redefined yet, and the moment she sees that your behavior doesn't distort under uncertainty, something important changes. The interaction stops feeling like something she has to manage. And when that pressure disappears, distance stops expanding on its own. 5. What she's actually watching. When you stop chasing. There's a moment in this dynamic that most men never recognize while it's happening. You stop chasing, not as a strategy, not as a game, just because something in you resets the pace. No extra messages, no checking if she saw it, no attempts to reopen a conversation she's left on pause. And what happens next is not silence from her side, it's observation. Because now the interaction changes form. Before, she was responding inside a moving exchange. Now, she's looking at what remains when she stops contributing to it. That's where her attention goes. Not to what you say, but to what you continue doing without her input. You'll see it in subtle behavior shifts. She may not fully re-engage, but she won't fully disappear either. She stays in a low-level presence, watching without initiating, checking the space without announcing it. And most men misread this completely. They assume nothing is happening because nothing is being said. But psychologically, this is where evaluation becomes sharper, because chasing removes ambiguity. If you chase, she sees immediate intent. But when you stop, something more important appears, your baseline. Not your reaction, not your effort spikes, not your emotional adjustments, your default state. And that is what she's measuring now. For example, if you were previously increasing effort and suddenly you don't, she notices the contrast. If you were always available and now you're not overextending, she registers the shift. If you stop compensating for her distance, she begins to recalibrate the dynamic internally, not consciously in a structured way, but through pattern recognition. What remains when pressure disappears? That's the question being answered. And here's where most men sabotage it without realizing. They assume stopping chase means total withdrawal. So they go cold, disappear, remove presence entirely. But that's not stability. That's rupture. It sends a different message entirely. The key is not absence. It's consistency without pursuit. You remain present at a normal level, but you no longer escalate based on her behavior. That distinction matters, because what she's watching is not whether you care, it's whether your behavior is dependent on her movement. If she steps back and you collapse forward, that's dependency. If she steps back and you disappear, that's instability. But if she steps back and nothing distorts, you stay consistent, that's something else. That creates recalibration. There's another layer most men don't notice. When chasing stops, she often increases micro-checks, brief returns, short messages, indirect engagement. Not enough to restart the full connection, but enough to test whether access still exists without effort from her side. And she's not doing this to confuse you. She's mapping continuity. What happens when she re-enters without you forcing it? Does the interaction feel pressured? Does it feel altered? Or does it feel unchanged? That answer determines what she does next. What you should avoid here is over-interpreting these micro-moments. Don't turn them into signals to escalate again. Don't assume they require a response beyond normal pacing. Because the moment you respond emotionally to them, you reintroduce chase behavior into a phase where she's testing stability. What actually works here is simple. You stay unchanged. Not distant, not reactive, not overly engaged, just consistent. Because when chasing stops and nothing collapses, the dynamic stops feeling like something she has to manage. And when that pressure drops, her behavior starts shifting on its own, without prompting. 6. The shift that happens when you stay emotionally stable. There's a point where everything changes, but nothing obvious happens. No big message from her, no apology, no sudden return to how things used to be. Just a slow adjustment in how she interacts with you. And most men miss this phase completely because they're still waiting for something loud to confirm it. But the shift is quieter than that. It starts in pacing. She stops responding with that same guarded distance. Replies become slightly more natural again. Not warm, not emotional, just less controlled. The structure of the interaction stops feeling like she's actively managing it. And that only happens after one thing has been proven repeatedly over time. You don't collapse under her distance. Not once. Not inconsistently. Not conditionally. You stay emotionally stable while she moves in and out of engagement. And that stability changes what she's dealing with internally. Because at first, when she distances herself, she expects reaction. Most people react. They chase, they question, they adjust their behavior to recover what was lost. But when that doesn't happen, when nothing escalates, something else starts to register. There's no pressure coming back at her, no emotional demand, no corrective behavior, no attempt to restore the old dynamic, just continuity. And continuity under uncertainty is rare enough that it changes perception. You'll see it in small behavioral returns, a slightly longer reply than necessary, a message that doesn't have a clear function, a return of small conversational details she previously removed. Not all at once, not dramatically, incrementally. What most men misunderstand is what caused it. They think it's because she missed you or realized something. But what actually changed is her internal risk calculation. When your emotional state remains stable during distance, the situation stops escalating in her mind. It stops feeling like something that will spiral if re-engaged, and that reduces resistance. There's also something else happening underneath that most men don't see. She starts testing re-entry without commitment, short messages, indirect engagement, brief check-ins that don't require emotional investment. She's not fully returning. She's checking whether return is even necessary anymore. And your response determines the direction. If you overreact, she reverts back to distance. If you overengage, she tightens control again. If you stay consistent, she begins to normalize presence. That's the shift. Not emotional confession, not clarity, not explanation, normalization. There's a subtle sign inside this stage that's often overlooked. She stops treating interaction like something she has to manage carefully. The hesitation reduces. The pacing becomes less calculated. The energy becomes less filtered. It's not full comfort, but it's no longer controlled distance either. What changed wasn't your words. It was your reaction pattern. You removed emotional volatility from the system, and when volatility disappears, the need for distance weakens. Because distance was being used as control, and control is only necessary when behavior feels unpredictable. Now, here's what you avoid doing at this stage. Don't celebrate the shift. Don't increase effort. Don't try to accelerate her return to normal. Because if you spike emotionally now, you reintroduce instability into a phase that is just starting to settle. What you do instead is keep the same baseline you had during distance. Same tone, same pacing, same absence of emotional escalation. Because what she's now learning is not whether she can get a reaction from you. It's whether she can stay connected to you without needing to manage the interaction. And when that becomes clear, the dynamic stops cycling through distance at the same intensity. Not because she was pulled back, but because she no longer needs to step away to stabilize herself. When a woman distances herself, the mistake is assuming the situation is already defined. It usually isn't. It's in motion, and your reaction becomes part of what shapes it. Chasing creates pressure. Disappearing creates rupture. Stability changes the structure entirely. If your behavior stays consistent while hers shifts, the dynamic stops escalating. Not because you forced anything back, but because you stopped feeding instability into it. What remains after that is simple. She no longer needs distance to regulate the connection, and when that need fades, her behavior stops running away from you and starts adjusting around you again.